Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our presentation. This is Statutory and Regulatory Requirements, Anticipating Expectations Within a Quality Management System, ISO 9001 Audit. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager and a member of the PGR Executive Committee. Couple of notes for everyone. All of our participants today are on mute, but we absolutely want to take your questions, so please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will take your questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions we get is, will the presentation be available after we're finished? The answer is yes. The slides will be available for download shortly after we're done. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the voiceover, that will be available on the PJR YouTube page. And you can find the links for both of those on the PJR website. So our presentation for today, we're going to talk a little bit about what statutory and regulatory requirements are. And we're going to get into why PJR includes statutory and regulatory requirements in the context of an ISO 9001 audit. We're also going to draw some linkages to the ISO 9001 standard in terms of where these requirements are found. We'll have some helpful examples of statutory and regulatory requirements, a couple concluding remarks, and then your questions. So in terms of what statutory and regulatory requirements are, let's begin with the official definitions that appear in the ISO 9000 Fundamentals and Vocabulary document. Statutory requirement is defined as an obligatory requirement specified by a legislative body. Regulatory requirement is an obligatory requirement specified by an authority. Mandated by a legislative body. In other words, they've been empowered by that legislative body. Now, the main difference between the statutory and regulatory requirements is where the requirements come from. So, statutory requirements come from statutes. They are legal requirements that come from laws. These would be laws, for example, passed by state or federal governments, such as Congress. A regulatory requirement is going to come from regulations, hence the name. So some examples of these are going to be EPA requirements, OSHA requirements, FDA, FAA, and so forth. Regulations are generally going to be rules that are issued by an agency to which the government has given the authority. They've empowered this agency to do something, and these are often found in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. So for example, the Food and Drug Administration is statutorily authorized to regulate food and drug safety through the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Safety Act. Now, when you want to get into the minutia of what that means, you're going to find specific labeling and packaging requirements in Title 21 of the CFR. These are the regulations that are issued by the FDA in order to help them fulfill their statutory authority to regulate. So to kind of simplify it and to try to just put it in very simple terms, think of statutory requirements as the law. And very typically, these are going to be very general and non-specific. And the regulations are going to be the rules that are developed interpreting the law and ensuring that we stay within it. And obviously, this is where the specificity would be applied. So for example, you may have a statute that says excessive levels of certain pollutants shall not be permitted in or near major bodies of water. Now, what the EPA would do with that is issue a regulation that defines, okay, what's excessive? What constitutes a major body of water? And what would be the plan of enforcement? How would we go about enforcing this particular statute? So why is PJR assessing these things? Why are we including these requirements in the context of an ISO 9001 audit? Well, the short version is we have to. PJR is held accountable to a number of requirements as a accredited CB, and one of the primary requirements that we're held accountable to is the ISO 17021 2015 standard. Now, if you read that standard, it says that auditing shall include the client's management system ability and its performance regarding the meeting of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. So we're obligated to look at this as part of the audit process. Now, in terms of where ISO 9001 has addressed these requirements, there are actually 6 specific places in the auditable portion of the standard where statutory and regulatory requirements are mentioned. And most of these are fairly general mentions. In 512A, we have a requirement that says you have to ensure that top management is determining statutory and regulatory requirements, and that they are taking an active role in ensuring that those requirements are understood and are consistently met. So essentially, management has to lead. In 822A1, we have a requirement for inclusion of statutory and regulatory requirements among the things that are being discussed in the contractual phase with the organization's customers. So, for example, if the customers have a requirement built into the blueprint, or if there's something in the terms and conditions that mentions statutory and regulatory compliance, the organization has to be savvy enough to pick up on those things and make sure that whatever those requirements may be, that they are flowed down appropriately, that it makes it to your engineering department or production planning department or whatever the case may be. In 8231D, it says that whatever those requirements might be, once you've determined them, now you have to review those requirements, and you have to do so prior to committing to supply the product or service to the customer. So if you review the requirement and you see something that you can't do, you've got to sort that out before you submit the quote or accept the PO or whatever the case may be. In 833C, there is a requirement that statutory and regulatory requirements have to be included in design inputs during the design process if you happen to be design responsible. In 842C1, it states that if you have external providers, whatever external providers you're using, they cannot adversely affect compliance to regulatory statutory requirements. And then finally, in 855A, it states that you need to make sure that statutory and regulatory requirements are considered when you're determining the extent of applicable post-delivery activities. So a good example of that might be if there is a regulatory requirement that mandates you have to provide recycling services for the product that you manufacture. That's the sort of thing that would then fall under post-delivery activity. So a couple of possible examples there. So what has Perry Johnson done specifically to approach this requirement? Well, what we've done is we've put a couple of targeted questions in the audit report that pertain to statutory and regulatory requirements. And what we intend by this is to prompt appropriate investigation and discourse with the auditee. We want to have a dialogue. We want our auditors to have a dialogue with the client and make sure that everyone's on the same page with these requirements. Now, what are some possible examples, things that might actually apply in most operations? Well, I've put up the 3 most common that we've seen over the history of this being an applicable set of expectations. The first and most prevalent of these are the Occupational Health and Safety Requirements, or OSHA. So this is going to get into things like PPE, ergonomics, safety training, and so forth. Just about every organization that we certify to ISO 9001 has some manner of requirements related to OSHA compliance. And our auditors may find some evidence of that spilling into things like training and maintenance and so forth. Another good example would be the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR requirements. These are very common in the aerospace industry, anybody that works with the Department of Defense, and so forth. So this could manifest in areas like controlled access to the facility, controlled access to records, things of this nature. Similar to the OSHA requirements, we have the safety data sheets. You may know these as MSDS, was the former name for these. These are going to impact potentially handling, use, disposal, etc. It could be chemical-based products, could be a lot of different things. If you clean your products, if you wash your products, there may be some impact from these documents in those protocols. If you have raw materials where there are particular requirements that you have to adhere to, some of your policies may be based on some of the SDS requirements therein. So these are some examples of statutory and regulatory requirements that are flowing into the day-to-day activity. So how are our auditors going to be determining which requirements apply? Well, our auditors already are reviewing a number of things where some of these requirements might be coming up. They're already going to be tasked with reviewing contracts from customers, purchase orders from customers, reviewing blueprints for products, specifications. Some of this may even come out of your website. Now, it's entirely possible that the auditor will do all of this due diligence and come away with very little of consequence, and essentially say that beyond basic compliance to OSHA, there is nothing to assess here. That's entirely possible for this particular assessment. Now, one of the things that we've emphasized to our auditors is this assessment is limited to confirming that you, our auditee, has an effective process in place for identifying and complying with relevant statutory and regulatory requirements. I will remind you of how this is worded in the 17021 standard. The client's management system ability and performance regarding the meeting of requirements. The emphasis in particular is in that phrase, ability. Our job is to make sure that you have an effective process for identifying and implementing what applies to you, not to audit the specific line items therein. We're not there to be OSHA auditors or EPA auditors or anything of that nature. Our job is strictly make sure that you have an effective process in place. And that's informed by how we have structured the portion of the audit workbook that pertains to this. We have a targeted question. Is there an effective process? Yes or no? The second question, is there anything going on where it was necessary for you to sample overall implementation or understanding of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements? And in the example here, it's clearly for an aerospace or defense-based company. They have an ITAR protocol, and they even have a DFARS protocol in terms of using domestic sources for purchasing raw materials. So this is a good example of how our assessment might be structured. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering, well, okay, is it possible that this may result in a nonconformance? It is certainly conceivable that an auditor could find a nonconformance for an issue pertaining to statutory and regulatory requirements. but it's going to be dependent on a couple of key factors. Number one, does the issue impact customer satisfaction or the attainment of a quality objective? And does it impede your ability to manufacture your product or render your service? If the organization is warranted, remember that the auditor is still required to cite the appropriate requirement from ISO 9001:2015. So in conclusion, we want to ensure that we are providing you with a value-added audit while meeting all applicable requirements. It is our hope that you will use the points of today's presentation to have a good understanding of what our expectations are going to be when it comes to statutory and regulatory requirements. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have a presentation called The Interaction of Processes and its Importance to a Successful Audit. This one is shown roughly every quarter. It's an examination of processes and how to correctly understand them. We have a separate presentation just on non-applicable clauses and what our expectations are in determining whether a requirement is truly non-applicable. And we've got a variety of other presentations. We cover stage 1 auditing. We have 2 presentations just on ISO 9001 itself. We have presentations on IETF 16949 and so forth. We like to keep in touch with our clients, and the best way for us to do that is to have those clients opt in for future updates. If you go to our website at www.pjr.com, go to the bottom of the page, you'll find a space for your email address. If you click subscribe, you'll be automatically informed of important news updates, upcoming webinars, and other points of interest. I do thank you for your time. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard if anybody has any questions today. Okay, thank you everyone. Have a great day.